Imagine sitting in a doctor's office, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly overhead, and hearing the words no one ever wants to hear. You have a terminal illness. That's exactly what happened to Richard Hayes when he was just 60 years old. Richard was an ordinary man from Asheville, North Carolina. He had worked hard his entire life, 40 years at the same manufacturing plant, paid his taxes, raised his 2 kids with love, and always did what was expected. He was the kind of man who planned for retirement the way most people plan for a vacation, carefully, patiently, believing that his golden years would be spent relaxing, gardening, and maybe taking a few quiet road trips with his wife, Mary. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. Richard had been feeling unusually tired for months, brushing it off as just part of getting older. But when the fatigue turned into chest pains and strange aches that wouldn't go away, Mary urged him to see a doctor. After a battery of tests and endless waiting, the diagnosis came: a rare, aggressive form of cancer. The prognosis was grim. 6 months, maybe a year if he was lucky. He sat there in stunned silence as the doctor explained treatment options, none of which offered much hope. Mary squeezed his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. Their world, once predictable and safe, had just shattered. For days, Richard moved through his life like a ghost, haunted by the weight of those words. He thought about all the things he hadn't done, the dreams he had shelved for someday, the places he'd always wanted to see, the adventures he had told himself could wait. And now, there was no more time. Or was there? One evening, as he sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, a thought struck him with unexpected clarity. If his days were truly numbered, why not make every single one of them count? That question changed everything. Richard made a decision that night, a decision that would not only redefine his own life, but inspire countless others. He vowed that, however long he had left, he would live without fear, without hesitation, and without regret. He would chase every dream, big and small, and squeeze every last drop of joy from the time he had remaining. What no one, least of all Richard, could have predicted was that his story was just beginning. Instead of 6 months, he lived 20 more years. 20 incredible years filled with wild adventures, breathtaking experiences, and personal triumphs that rewrote the very definition of what it means to truly live. How did a man who was told his life was over turn that sentence into 2 decades of fearless, exhilarating living? What can his journey teach us about hope, courage, and the unstoppable power of the human spirit? If you're still here, feel free to subscribe, because Richard's extraordinary story is about to unfold. And trust me, it's one you'll never forget. Richard Hayes would never forget the moment his world cracked open. It was a chilly Tuesday morning when he and his wife, Mary, sat nervously in the small, sterile doctor's office, the walls lined with faded anatomy posters. The doctor entered, holding a thick folder, his face serious and heavy with unspoken words. Richard's heart pounded in his chest as the doctor sat down and carefully began to explain. The words came out slowly, but each one hit like a hammer. You have a rare, aggressive form of cancer. We estimate 6 months to a year. Richard felt the room spin, his ears ringing as if underwater. Mary gasped quietly, her hand gripping his so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Tears welled in her eyes before the doctor had even finished speaking. Richard, always the quiet and stoic type, nodded numbly, his mind racing far ahead of the conversation. Treatment options were discussed, but every path seemed steeped in uncertainty and despair. By the time they left the office, a thick cloud of silence settled over them, broken only by the soft echo of their footsteps down the hallway. Driving home, Richard stared out the window, the world passing by like a blur. Mary finally spoke, her voice trembling. We'll fight this. Whatever it takes, we'll fight. Richard wanted to believe her, but deep inside, he felt a hollow ache, a gnawing sense that everything had already changed forever. The next days were filled with tearful phone calls to family, quiet moments of shock, and the heavy weight of uncertainty. Their children, now grown with families of their own, rushed home to be by their side, their faces pale and tight with fear. Friends and neighbors stopped by with casseroles and kind words, but nothing seemed to lift the oppressive weight that had settled over the Hayes household. Richard found himself wandering through his home, touching familiar objects, photographs from family vacations, his old baseball glove, the small wooden rocking chair he had built for his first grandchild. Each item felt like a relic, a piece of a life that was slipping through his fingers faster than he could hold on. Nights were the hardest. Alone with his thoughts, Richard lay awake staring at the ceiling, grappling with questions he had never dared ask before. What had his life meant? Had he done enough? What dreams had he left behind, thinking there would always be time? For a while, grief consumed him. He withdrew, avoiding conversations about the future and moving through each day as if on autopilot. Mary did her best to keep him hopeful, but Richard's quiet despair ran deep. He couldn't help but feel that the clock was ticking down, and he was powerless to stop it. And yet, somewhere in that darkness, a quiet ember of defiance began to glow, a small but growing belief that maybe, just maybe, there was still something left to fight for. What he didn't realize yet was that this spark of hope would soon ignite a fire that would change everything. It started with a single moment, small, almost insignificant on the surface, but powerful enough to shift the course of Richard's life forever. About a month after his diagnosis, Richard was sitting on his porch, watching the world pass him by. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, the sun dipped low on the horizon, and somewhere nearby, children's laughter echoed faintly. He sat there, wrapped in his thoughts, feeling numb and disconnected, when Mary came outside and handed him a cup of coffee. She sat beside him in silence for a few minutes, then finally said, "Do you remember when we used to talk about traveling the country in an RV after retirement?" Richard let out a soft, bitter laugh. "Yeah, that was the plan. But now," Mary turned to him, her eyes sharp and clear. What if we don't wait? What if we just do it now?" Richard stared at her, the idea hanging between them, wild and impossible, and yet, strangely, it ignited something inside him. For weeks, he had felt like his life was over, like all that was left to do was wait. But now, a tiny voice whispered, "Why wait for the end when there's still time to live?" That night, Richard lay awake, replaying their conversation over and over. He thought about all the dreams he had shelved, the things he had always told himself he'd get to someday. But what if someday was now? What if, instead of dying on a timeline set by doctors, he decided to live on his own terms? The next morning, Richard sat down with Mary and their children and said something that surprised even himself. "I want to make a list of everything I've ever dreamed of doing. And I want to start checking things off. Right now." His family, though emotional and hesitant at first, quickly rallied around him. They called it his life list, refusing to use the words bucket list because this wasn't about dying, it was about living. Within days, Richard had booked his first big adventure, skydiving. It was something he had joked about for years but had always dismissed as too dangerous, too crazy, too impossible. But now, danger felt irrelevant compared to the thrill of truly feeling alive. He also made plans for other dreams, visiting the Grand Canyon, taking a hot air balloon ride, learning to scuba dive, and even writing a memoir. The more he dreamed, the more energized he felt. It was as if deciding to live fully had flipped a switch inside him, flooding his once dark world with color and light. Mary watched with tears of pride in her eyes as her husband transformed before her. The man who had once sat quietly waiting for the inevitable was now brimming with life, his eyes sparkling with excitement and determination. Richard didn't know how much time he had left, but for the first time since his diagnosis, he wasn't afraid. He was ready to chase every single dream, no matter how big or small. And this was only the beginning. The day Richard jumped out of an airplane at 10,000 feet, he felt more alive than he had in years. The wind roared in his ears, his heart hammered in his chest, and as he free fell through the sky, he let out a laugh so loud and wild that his instructor said later it echoed all the way down. When his parachute finally deployed and he floated gently toward the earth, Richard looked out over the sprawling landscape and whispered to himself, "I'm still here. I'm really living." That first leap set the tone for everything that followed. Within weeks, Richard and Mary packed up their modest belongings and hit the road in a second-hand RV they lovingly named the Dream Chaser. With no strict itinerary, they let curiosity guide them. Their first big stop, the Grand Canyon. Standing at the edge of that breathtaking chasm, Richard felt a deep, humbling awe. He closed his eyes, breathed in the crisp air, and held Mary's hand tightly. "Can you believe we're really doing this?" he whispered. From there, they ventured west to California, where Richard learned to surf, another dream he'd laughed off in his younger years. The instructor, a sun-weathered man half his age, raised an eyebrow when Richard showed up, but Richard was undeterred. It took several tries and more than a few wipeouts, but when he finally caught a wave, the cheers from Mary and a small crowd on the beach made him beam with pride. They floated in hot air balloons over the rolling hills of Napa Valley, watched the northern lights dance across the Alaskan sky, and explored the bustling streets of New York City, where Richard marveled at Broadway shows and fine dining he'd only seen on television. For Richard, every new experience felt like a victory, not just over the disease but over the years of playing it safe, of postponing joy for a future that was never guaranteed. One especially memorable adventure took them to New Zealand, where Richard bungee jumped off the Kawarau Bridge, arms outstretched, the wind roaring as he plummeted toward the river below. The adrenaline rush was unlike anything he'd felt before, and when he was hoisted back up, his laughter was pure and contagious. Throughout it all, Richard kept a journal, writing down not just where they went and what they did, but how each experience made him feel. His entries were raw and honest, filled with reflections on fear, courage, and the surprising beauty of stepping far outside his comfort zone. Every postcard he sent home to friends and family carried the same closing line, "Still chasing dreams. Still fighting." And as the months turned into years, it became clear that Richard's story wasn't just about ticking boxes off a list. It was about redefining what it meant to truly live. Because even as his body carried the burden of illness, his spirit soared higher than ever before. Of course, the journey wasn't all smooth sailing. As much as Richard was determined to live fully, his illness was never far behind, a quiet shadow that sometimes roared back into view without warning. About a year into his adventure-filled life, Richard began experiencing sharp pains and overwhelming fatigue. They were on a road trip through Arizona when, one morning, he woke up barely able to get out of bed. His body, once brimming with new energy, felt heavy and unfamiliar again. Mary sat beside him, her eyes full of worry. "Maybe it's time to slow down," she suggested gently. Reluctantly, they cut their trip short and returned home for medical evaluations. The news wasn't good. The cancer had advanced. His doctors were amazed he had done as much as he had already, and some gently urged him to consider settling down, to rest, to make peace with what was coming. But Richard wasn't ready to surrender. He agreed to undergo another round of treatment, not because he believed it would cure him, but because he wanted more time. More time to dream, more time to love, and more time to live on his terms. The chemo days were grueling. Richard lost weight, his hair thinned, and his energy flagged. There were days when he barely left his bed, his body racked with exhaustion and nausea. During those hard times, Richard leaned on Mary more than ever. She was his rock, bringing tea, reading to him from his favorite books, and reminding him, gently but firmly, that he was still the man who had danced with life on the edge of cliffs and surfboards. On his darkest days, Richard would look at the photos on the walls, images of him skydiving, laughing, exploring new places, and whisper to himself, "That's me. I'm still that man." What surprised him most during these struggles was how much strength he found in the memories he had created. Each adventure, each triumph, became a source of fuel, a reminder that even if his body faltered, his spirit remained undefeated. There were setbacks, too, in other ways. Richard had moments of crushing doubt and fear. He worried about Mary, about his children and grandchildren, about whether chasing his dreams had been selfish or reckless. But every time those doubts crept in, he was met with unwavering love and support. His family reminded him again and again that his courage had inspired them all to live more fully in their own lives. One particularly hard night, lying in bed staring at the ceiling, Richard whispered to Mary, "Do you think I've made a difference?" Mary squeezed his hand tightly. "Richard," she said softly, tears in her eyes, "you've taught us all how to live. That's more than most people can say." In the end, Richard's challenges only deepened his gratitude. He realized that life's beauty wasn't in its perfection, but in its imperfection, in the way we rise again and again, no matter how many times we're knocked down. And every time he got back up, Richard proved to himself, and to everyone around him, that even in the face of the hardest battles, life is still worth fighting for. As the years unfolded, Richard began to understand that some of the most meaningful dreams weren't about adventure or adrenaline. They were about healing old wounds and reconnecting with the people who mattered most. One of the biggest items on his life list wasn't written down at first. It was something he had quietly carried for decades: the strained relationship with his younger brother, Tom. They had grown apart years ago over a bitter argument about their parents' estate, an argument that spiraled into years of silence. Richard often thought about reaching out, but had always convinced himself it was too late, too complicated. But now, facing his own mortality head-on, Richard realized that unfinished business weighed heavier than any missed adventure. So one afternoon, with Mary's encouragement, he picked up the phone and dialed Tom's number, his hands trembling as the line rang. "Hello," came the familiar but older voice on the other end. Richard's throat tightened. "Tom, it's me." "Richard." There was a long pause, a moment heavy with years of silence, before Tom finally replied, his voice thick with emotion. "Rich, I've been waiting for this call." What followed was a conversation filled with apologies, tears, and, most importantly, forgiveness. They talked for hours, unpacking years of hurt and regret, and by the end of the call, something long buried between them had begun to heal. A few weeks later, they met in person, two brothers, older and wiser, embracing not just each other, but the fragile beauty of reconciliation. Richard also made it a mission to spend deeper, more intentional time with his children and grandchildren. No longer content with surface-level conversations, he asked them about their dreams, their fears, and their joys. He wrote each of his grandchildren personal letters, filled with advice, love, and the hope that they would live boldly and fearlessly. He even took Mary on a second honeymoon to Italy, a dream they had shelved for years. Walking hand in hand through the cobbled streets of Florence, sipping wine under the stars in Tuscany, Richard looked at Mary with tears in his eyes and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." Mary smiled and kissed his cheek. "We've still got so much life left to live, Richard, and I'm with you every step of the way." In those moments, whether reconciling with his brother, holding his grandchildren close, or dancing with Mary under the Italian moonlight, Richard discovered a truth deeper than any thrill or adventure. The greatest dreams are often the ones that bring us closer to love, forgiveness, and human connection. His journey wasn't just about checking boxes on a list. It was about making peace with others, with himself, and with the winding, unpredictable road that life had laid before him. And in those quiet, powerful moments of reconnection, Richard felt something more profound than excitement or victory. He felt whole. As the whirlwind of adventures and emotional milestones began to settle into a rhythm, Richard found himself drawn more and more to moments of quiet reflection. The man who had once raced from one thrill to the next now cherished the stillness between each heartbeat, realizing that the real treasure of his journey was not just in what he had done, but in what he had learned. Sitting on his porch in the early mornings, Richard would sip his coffee and watch the sunrise slowly paint the sky in brilliant hues. These became his favorite moments, when the world was quiet and his thoughts flowed freely. He often opened his journal, now worn and thick with entries, and wrote down the reflections that bubbled up from deep inside. One morning, as a soft breeze rustled the leaves, he wrote, "Fear is the heaviest thing a person can carry. But when you set it down, even just for a moment, you realize how light your soul becomes." Richard had spent much of his early life playing it safe, working hard, providing for his family, sticking to routines. But his diagnosis had stripped away the illusion of control, forcing him to confront life's fragility head-on. What surprised him most was how freeing that realization had become. "I used to think time was something we could count on," he confided to Mary one evening, as they sat beneath a sky glittering with stars. "But it's not about how much time we have, it's about what we do with it." Mary squeezed his hand gently. "And you've done more with your time than most people do in a lifetime." His reflections also turned toward gratitude. Despite the hardships and the dark days, Richard felt profoundly thankful for the love of his family, for the unexpected strength within himself, and for the beauty of the world he had gotten to experience firsthand. He shared these thoughts openly with friends and strangers alike, often speaking at local community events or writing letters to others facing serious illnesses. His message was always the same: live now. Don't wait for a crisis to wake you up. The time to chase your dreams and connect deeply with others is always today. One evening, as he sat with his grandchildren around a crackling bonfire, his youngest granddaughter asked, "Grandpa, are you scared to die?" Richard thought for a long moment before answering, his eyes reflecting the glow of the flames. "You know," he said softly, "I was once. But now? No. I've seen and done things I never imagined. I've loved deeply, laughed loudly, and made peace with the things that once kept me up at night. I'm not scared anymore because I know I've truly lived." His words hung in the air, a gift to everyone around that fire, a reminder that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the choice to move forward in spite of it. And in these moments of deep introspection, Richard realized that while his adventures had been incredible, the greatest reward was something much simpler: the quiet, powerful knowledge that he had honored his life to the fullest. As Richard entered his late 70s, the toll of his illness became more pronounced. His once strong body grew frailer, and everyday tasks that had once been easy now required more effort and patience. But if there was one thing Richard had learned, it was that joy wasn't measured by how fast you could move or how far you could travel. It was measured by how deeply you embraced each moment, no matter the circumstances. He and Mary eventually sold their beloved RV, trading life on the road for a quieter pace at home. But even with the adventures winding down, Richard's spirit remained as bold as ever. He found new ways to nurture his sense of wonder, joining a local photography club, where he learned to capture the beauty of the world through his lens, and starting a small vegetable garden that became his pride and joy. "Every seed I plant," he told Mary with a smile, "feels like a promise to keep going." His health challenges grew, but Richard refused to let them steal his sense of purpose. Even on the hardest days, when his body ached and his breath came short, he found small victories to celebrate. Sitting by the window, watching the birds flock to the feeder he had built, or listening to his favorite jazz records while holding Mary's hand, These simple pleasures became his new adventures. Richard also dedicated time to mentoring others who had been given life-altering diagnoses. He met regularly with a support group, sharing his story and offering words of encouragement to those grappling with fear and uncertainty. His presence alone, living proof that a terminal diagnosis didn't have to be a death sentence, became a beacon of hope. One of his proudest moments during these later years was when his memoir was finally published. Titled The Life List: How I Learned to Live Fully When Time Was Running Out, the book became a local bestseller, inspiring readers far beyond his own community. Strangers would write letters of thanks, telling him how his words had helped them face their own challenges with new courage. Mary, ever by his side, marveled at how her husband continued to bloom in ways neither of them had expected. "You never stop surprising me," she whispered one night as they sat watching a brilliant sunset. Richard smiled, his eyes shining. "Life's too short to stop growing," he replied. Even as his world grew smaller, Richard's gratitude expanded. Every sunrise was a blessing, every hug from his grandchildren a treasure. He learned that while the grand adventures had been thrilling, it was these quiet, ordinary moments that truly filled his heart. By the time he reached 80, Richard had far outlived every expectation set for him. And though his body was weaker, his spirit remained unbreakable, a testament to the power of choosing life, again and again, no matter the odds. And as he often said to friends and family, with a wink and a grin, "I may be slowing down, but I'm still chasing dreams, just at a gentler pace." As Richard's remarkable journey reached its final chapter, something beautiful became clear. His story had rippled far beyond his own life. What started as a personal mission to live fully despite a grim diagnosis had blossomed into a legacy that touched countless hearts. In his community, Richard became somewhat of a legend. People often referred to him as the man who defied the odds, a symbol of resilience and hope. Local newspapers ran stories about his adventures. His memoir inspired reading clubs and hospital programs, and his presence at community events always drew a crowd. Even those who had never met him felt connected to his courage. His family, too, carried his legacy deeply. His grandchildren often spoke proudly of their grandpa at school, sharing stories of his skydiving, his travels, and his unwavering zest for life. His daughter, Emily, started a nonprofit dedicated to helping seniors pursue their dreams, inspired by her father's life list. And Mary, his partner through every high and low, found solace and pride in knowing that their love story had shown the world the power of steadfast devotion. Richard's home became a place of pilgrimage of sorts. Friends, neighbors, and even strangers would stop by, eager to sit on his porch and hear firsthand how he had turned tragedy into triumph. Richard, ever humble, always welcomed them with a warm smile and a cup of coffee. "I'm just an ordinary man," he'd say. "I just decided to live like time mattered." In the final months of his life, Richard's health declined more rapidly. But even then, his heart stayed light. He spent his days surrounded by family, telling stories, laughing, and soaking in every remaining moment with gratitude. On his last birthday, they threw him a huge party, complete with balloons, music, and a slideshow of his greatest adventures. Richard sat in his wheelchair, tears in his eyes, as he looked around the room filled with love. "You all are my greatest adventure," he told them, his voice soft but clear. "Thank you for helping me live the best life I could have ever dreamed of." When Richard finally passed, peacefully and surrounded by those he loved most, his town mourned, but also celebrated. His funeral was more of a tribute than a farewell, filled with music, laughter, and stories of the man who had shown everyone how to embrace life, no matter the circumstances. And long after his passing, Richard's story continued to inspire. His memoir was reprinted, his nonprofit flourished, and his name became a quiet touchstone for those facing hard diagnoses or difficult times. People often said that when they felt scared or stuck, they'd ask themselves, what would Richard do? The answer was always the same: live boldly, love deeply, and never waste a single moment. And in that way, Richard's heart kept beating. In every act of courage, every leap of faith, and every dream chased by those who followed in his fearless footsteps. Richard Hayes's journey is proof that life's most meaningful chapters aren't always the ones we plan. They're often the ones we never see coming. His story began with a diagnosis that felt like the end, but instead of surrendering to fear, Richard chose to lean into life with everything he had. He transformed what should have been his final months into 2 incredible decades of adventure, love, and deep personal growth. And along the way, he showed everyone around him, and everyone watching now, that living fully isn't about how long you have, but about how fiercely you embrace each moment. Richard taught us that courage isn't always loud or flashy. Sometimes it's as simple as getting out of bed on the hardest days, holding your loved ones close, and choosing joy even when the odds seem stacked against you. He reminded us that dreams don't have an expiration date, and that the only thing truly standing between us and a life well lived is the decision to say yes while we still can. If Richard were here today, he'd likely say something simple but powerful. Stop waiting. Don't save your dreams for tomorrow. Take that trip. Call that friend. Learn that skill. Whatever it is you've been putting off, start now. Because life is fragile and also incredibly resilient. So, what's that dream you've tucked away in a corner of your heart? What adventure, big or small, have you promised yourself someday? Richard's story is your invitation to bring it to the forefront, to start living the life you've always imagined, no matter where you are in your journey. We'd love to hear your thoughts and stories. What's one dream you still want to chase? Or maybe you've already had your own Richard moment. If so, share it in the comments. Your story could inspire someone else to take that first brave step. And if Richard's incredible journey touched your heart today, please give this video a like and consider subscribing. Here, we celebrate stories of resilience, courage, and the unstoppable human spirit, reminding us all that no matter the obstacles, it's never too late to dream big. Because it's never too late to dream.